Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton, back again for part two of the presentation on bystanders during the Holocaust. And I'm going to start by discussing the findings of a fascinating study by Professor Monroe called Cracking the Code of Genocide, the Moral Psychology of Rescuers, Bystanders, and Nazis During the Holocaust. So she interviews those that were living during the Nazi period, and she was able to see how she could look at the differences between rescuers, bystanders, and Nazis. And she did this in revolving around six major themes: self-image of the person, their identity, their ethical worldview, their ethical importance of values, their levels of personal suffering, and their cognitive categorization processes. In other words, how they see people. And in looking at this particular case, I'm going to focus on bystanders. In my PowerPoint, and of course in the article, I have an appendix in the PowerPoint that I've created that has the additional data on the rescuers and the Nazis on those categories I mentioned of self-image, identity, ethical worldview, and so on. But because of time issues, we'll go ahead and focus only on bystanders. And bystanders are different than rescuers and also different than the Nazi and Nazi supporters. But let's take a look at what she found. So I'll focus on bystanders for our purpose here. That in terms of self-concept, the bystanders viewed themselves as weak, having very little control over what happened or happens in their life. That they viewed themselves as weak. That in terms of identity, she came up with this theme that identity constrains choice. So these bystanders often were found to have low self-esteem and believe they had no choice. Now, rescuers also believe that they had no choice, but very different from the bystanders, because the bystanders have an external locus of the control, where the rescuers were more likely to believe that they had no choice, but they still could make a decision what they wanted to do in terms of to rescue or not to rescue. In terms of worldview, there were differences in how they defined the good life, with the bystanders focusing on material goods and leisure. Bystanders had a fatalism type idea that whatever happened was up to fate, and they lacked agency, as has been the central theme here when we talked about their self-concept, viewing themselves as weak. Their identity constrains choice. They had low self-esteem and believed they really had no choice to make, and the worldview that the differences regarding how they define the good life, with a focus on material goods and leisure. They also, in terms of value, they tended to show little or no remorse or sorrow for what happened to the Jews. That they had had a moral insensitivity as it related to the sanctity of life. In terms of trauma and suffering of others, the bystanders were often traumatized and were more untrusting and less sensitive. Now, what the research also shows is that being traumatized doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be less trusting and less sensitive and more likely to be a bystander, or for that matter, a perpetrator. Some that are traumatized find that they use that traumatization to empathize with others, to rescue others, and to help others. And of course, part of that process is figuring out, trauma occurs and why the divergent, paths to bystanders, Nazis, Nazi supporters, or rescuers. And then also looking at how they classified groups as others. Classifying a group as others or an out-group makes it easier to ignore or mistreat them. So a very fascinating study looking at those characteristics and differentiating between the bystanders, the rescuers, and the Nazis and Nazi supporters. If we look at some of the sociology of bystanding, and then we relate it to some theory that Sykes and Matza developed the idea of techniques of neutralization, and Alvarez applied those to genocide. And people learn the motives, the explanations, and the rationalizations for, in the case that Sykes and Matza were focused on juvenile delinquents, deviant behavior. But in our case, we'll look at bystanding behavior. So there's denial of responsibility. The person says, or the organization says, or the institution, has, so basically, we are not responsible. They may deny that injury occur, or they may deny that there's a victim, and then they condemn the condemners, and they also point out they're appealing to a higher loyalty. Captain Van Helvert took this model of neutralization and kind of brought it into a different mode and talked about distorting the facts. That, in other words, the bystanders might say, well, there's really no hard facts, or they might deny the reality of what's occurring, or they create new facts, and then negating the norm. And so they go ahead and they reduce or neutralize the norm of helping others. They blame the circumstances on others, and also focusing on the idea that they had limited or difficult options, limited roles and choices to play out. And they also are hiding behind oneself and presenting that they're ignorant or unaware or lacking the knowledge about what's going on, or for that matter, lacking the skills to act. And Bandura also talked about how people who engage in deviant behavior, and here we're going to assume that being a bystander would be deviant behavior, moral justification, euphemistic labeling, displacement of responsibility, again, which is not responsible and had no choice, and diffusion of responsibility, which is blaming authority figures for one's action, and then disregard or distortion of consequences, dehumanization, and blaming others. The euphemistic labeling is interesting when we start thinking about the terminologies that are used, how people became diseases, for example, or dangerous, and so we see this in genocide after genocide. The negative labels applied to people to dehumanize them. And this will wrap up this section, which focused more on theory. And then in the next section, what I'm going to do is to present a case study in more detail. And then in other sections, I'll have additional case studies. So this will wrap up the part 2 of the presentation.